Well, conservatives around the world are feeling particularly despondent this week after Canadians re-elected, can you believe it, the Liberal Party led by Mark Carney and previously led notoriously by Justin Trudeau for the past decade, who ducked off and disappeared just before this last election. Most conservatives around the world have sort of kept a one lazy eye on Canada, just assuming that Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservatives, would just romp at home at the next election because no country in the world would be stupid enough to re-elect a party like the Canadian Liberals after 10 years of tyranny. But they have. It's particularly depressing for us here in Australia because we're towards the end of a 2-week election period, which ends on Saturday. And the bookies are saying that we're about to do something as stupid as the Canadians just did and re-elect an equally globalist, multicultural, net zero, deluded party led by Anthony Albanese. Now, to reassure us that things aren't quite as bad as they seem, is law professor Jim Allan, Canadian himself, but now living in Queensland and one of Australia's leading conservative commentators. Jim, tell us all about it. Why shouldn't we be so worried?
Thanks for having me on, Fred. I'm not sure. I think you got me on under false premises. I'm not sure I can be a font of optimism here. But so look, when you're talking about Canada, in 2015, when Trudeau came in for the first of his 3 governments, 2 were minority, the first one was majority. The 2 wealthiest Canadian provinces, Alberta and Ontario, were in the top 10. If you looked at per capita wealth of those 2 provinces, they would have made the top 10 of U.S. wealthy states. I think one was 8th and one was 10th. So in the 10 years since then, the Liberal policies have been so impoverishing that the wealthiest Canadian province per capita wealth now, before Trump in November, is poorer than the poorest state, which I think is Mississippi. In other words, it's been a disaster. And, mass immigration, big spending, all the idiocies of COVID. And as you said, a lot of it was related to thuggery, the lockdown thuggery. But even leaving lockdown aside, this sort of near religious net zero cult attitude. And so Poilievre had built up a 20-point lead. And what you need to know is Canada is very left-wing. The median Canadian voter, I say this as a Canadian, when we go back to Canada, my wife and I can't believe it. I mean, really. So the median Canadian voter would be far to the left. Standard deviation more than the median Australian voter would be to the left of the median British voter. I think would be to the left of California. So the first thing to say is when Trump is saying he wants to incorporate Canada, he's obviously just taunting. No Republican wants to incorporate 38 million voters to the left of California. The Republicans would never win another election for president. So
Good point. Can I just stop you there though? Just very briefly, what makes Canadians such a bunch of socialist namby-pambies?
Well, they've always been big fans of government, and it really kicked off in the sort of depression, I would say. Until then, Canada, it was central government didn't spend very much on GDP. It was a tiny fraction. Canadians lost more people per capita in World War I think, than anyone, certainly more than Australia. Everyone complains in Australia about fighting in Gallipoli. Let me tell you, the Canadians were fighting on the Western Front, and anybody with a brain would have volunteered in a second to go to Gallipoli because the death rate on the Western Front was brutal. I have a lot of sympathy for Churchill. I know Australians don't. But if someone said, here's a 1 in 20 chance of sort of coming up from the backside, you'd take that chance. It's all very well with hindsight to say it wasn't going to work, but it almost did work. So Canada was this sort of basically slightly more centralized place than the U.S. And then in the 60s, Pierre Trudeau came in, and he is the founder of multiculturalism. This is Justin's dad. Canada became very, price and wage controls came in before Nixon did them. Canada has become very left-wing. The Liberals are the natural party of government in Canada. I think they've been in office about 2/3 of the last 120 years. This is the fourth term for this win by Carney makes the fourth term for the Liberals. And the problem is that the big population central provinces of Ontario and Quebec vote left, and the western provinces vote conservative. And just to give people a sense of this, imagine if you lived in the US or Australia and someone said there is a state where every single election, every single constituency votes conservative. That's Saskatchewan. The last two elections before this one, Conservatives won every seat in the entire province. Alberta, almost every seat. And this past election was no different. I think the Libs picked up one seat in Saskatchewan. But the West has a big concentration of Conservative voters. And on first past the post voting, that's a disaster. So they're not spread out around the country. So
Jim, the nature of politics these days seems to be that there are irreconcilable differences between the two traditional sides of politics. One side for big government, the other side for individuality and freedom. In Australia, that's troublesome because the two are geographically mostly intermixed, although, you go to the inner cities and you pretty much know you're surrounded by lefties. But what you're describing,
nice coffee, Fred.
they make a good latte.
Yeah. You as a
but they're all on the NDIS anyway. But anyway, can I just make the point, though, that you seem to be describing in Canada, they are actually geographically separated.
Well, I mean, we're talking generalities. Of course, there's some left-wing voters in Alberta, but by and large, it's a very conservative voting place, Alberta, Saskatchewan. And I mean, one of the problems is about 60% of Canadians are left. I mean, to the left of California left. And the way conservatives win, and they don't win very often, is it's first past the post, so you just get one vote. And conservatives win when the progressives split their vote. So when Harper won in 2011, he got a big majority. He only got 39.5% of the popular vote. And
that's less than what Poilievre got on the weekend.
On Monday, Poilievre got 41.5. That's the biggest share of the vote Conservatives had in Canada since 1988. So Trump did not drive Conservatives to the left. What happened is the left normally votes either Liberal, which is left, NDP, which is sort of like a hard left union type party, and then Green. And for the Conservatives to win, they need those left-wing parties to split. So when the NDP was at 17% in the polls and the Liberals were at 21%, this is back in October, Poilievre had a 20-point lead. But what no one said back then, except for me, was if you add up all the left-wing parties, they're still ahead of Poilievre, even though he's got. So what happened in this most recent election is all of the progressive voters, and this is a bit ironic, coalesced around this Davos man, ex-central banker, head of the Bank of England, head of the Bank of Canada. He's been a hedge fund guy. Elite as they come. His wife is a really pro-green. I think there are some trans kids in the family. I mean, you can't write this story. So on progressive issues, he's got every credential going. He worked at McKinsey's. And for some reason, the hard left, I'm talking about the NDP type, who are sort of redistribution of wealth types, they coalesced around him. And their share of the vote in 2021 was about 15%. And Monday it was 6%. So 9% of the vote went straight to Carney. The Green Party didn't run candidates in a lot of seats to help Carney. And so the Libs got about 2% more of the popular vote so they hit a high too. So what you've had in Canada is you've had this election has really sort of bifurcated the country in a way you don't normally see in Canada. Normally in Canada,
I hope the election we're going through doesn't have the same effect in Australia because
you can't do that with preferential voting. I don't like preferential. I'd rather have the Canadian system.
Yeah.
The trouble with preferential voting is you cannot discipline your side of politics. If you think that. And I just say this hypothetically, I couldn't possibly be saying this, because it relates to reality, Fred. I'm trying not to wink too often. But if you think your side of politics is running a terrible campaign, value-free, worthless, with some of the worst advisors ever, you still at some point on your ballot have to preference either Labour or the Liberals above the other one. Whereas in Canada, if you're mad at the Tories, you just vote for the monster raving loony party, one tick, and you leave the ballot box. Because if you lose your base, you got nothing.
Yeah.
Whereas the parties here in Australia, they know they can't lose their base. I mean, unless you're prepared to preference Labour over Liberals. In that Turnbull election, that's what I did in 2015. I was so mad. And I thought, Shorten's not the worst. He's not that much worse than Turnbull. And people would say to me, well, I didn't vote for the Libs. And I said, what do you mean? Well, I didn't put them first. I said, where did you put them? Fourth. Where did you put Labour? Fifth. I said, you voted for the Libs. Do you understand preferential voting?
Yeah.
If you put Liberal over Labour, you have voted for the Libs.
You have voted for the Libs, that's
and
right.
The advisor class knows this. And that's why they don't worry about the party base. They don't care that the vote, they can't hold on to their base because they've made the calculation that ultimately you will put them above Labour. Now, to some extent, they're getting this wrong because the preference flows on the right side of politics in Australia are only 85% flowing back to the coalition, whereas the Greens flow back to Labour at about 100%, just under 100. So not, having a first preference tally at, what is it right now, 34%, that's deadly for the Libs. It's deadly because they don't.
Well, let's bring that back to Australia now, because I think the one of the mistakes Poilievre made, I mean, what you've pointed out is very clear. Poilievre ran a pretty good campaign if he got, the highest vote in 40 years, but he didn't. He didn't say that he was prepared to work with Trump. He played that sovereign nationalist card that seems to work well in certain, everywhere left of the center.
I don't think he had to say he'd work with Trump. What he had to say was, if we're in a game of having to bargain with the president of the United States over tariffs, my party, the Conservative Party, will get a much better deal out of Trump than these people over here who, for the last 4 years, and there's loads of it on record, have been calling Trump a white nationalist, a racist, one of the worst, most despicable human. And what I think Poilievre should have done is come out on day one when Trump imposed the tariffs and said, if you think Mark Carney, who can't stop calling Trump names, is going to cut a better deal for Canada than me, let me just play you all of the horrible things they have been saying about Mr. Trump, and you can ask yourself, who's going to cut a better deal?
Well, let's relate that. That's a very good point, and let's relate that to Australia. How many cards is Peter Dutton holding in this? I mean, Anthony Albanese is on record saying that Trump scares him. Now, Australia's advantages: we have a trade surplus with the US. We buy more from the US than we sell them, so we are naturally we should be favoured by Trump because we have a good trade relationship with them. We're in AUKUS. All Peter Dutton had to say was, as you just said about Poilievre, is Albo doesn't know, is out of his depth in Washington. I'll play all the right cards, but he didn't say that. He hasn't said that.
The first thing that he said was, I support Kevin Rudd as ambassador. It's like the guy has completely wrong instincts. He should go and watch that Seinfeld episode where George Costanza does everything opposite to his instincts. If Dutton did everything opposite to his instincts, the first thing he would have said was, yeah, I don't accept welcome to country during Anzac Day. And I can tell you what a woman is. And I'd fire Kevin Rudd so fast his head would spin. And he doesn't. He's just weak. And then he goes back and they have focus groups and they talk about it for 2 days and they decide, a lot of Australians don't like welcome to country at Anzac Day. And then he comes back and says, well, it's overdone. But it's also mealy-mouthed. It's like, we all know that Dutton took a long, long time to come out against The Voice, and he was leaning towards having a conscience vote until he was talked out of it. So the guy's instincts are terrible.
His instincts are terrible. And it's depressing to watch. So, Jim, you're a very good observer of Canada and Australia. This is a rare occasion when in two successive weeks, both countries are going to a federal election. What's your take on? I mean, the world's eyes are going to turn from Canada to Australia. What is your prediction, and how will the world respond?
Well, I think if Tony Abbott had been leading the Liberals, they'd be romping home. You just watch him in action; he does everything better than than I thought Dutton was supposed to be conservative, but I'm not sure anymore. I mean, I think he's just indecisive, middle of the road, better than Morrison because he didn't, thuggishly lock down the whole country for 2.5 years like a thug. So he's better than Morrison, but then, you could throw a dart at the phone book and you'd find somebody better than Morrison.
Yeah.
But, he's been a massive disappointment, Dutton. Is he miles better than Albo? Yes. So both things can be true. It can be A, they've run a terrible campaign and he's not very good. And yet B, he's miles better than Albanese. This is the most awful government. I think it's probably worse than Whitlam's government. And so
I think you're right. And equally as bad as Trudeau, which is, the situation we find ourselves in. Sorry, go on.
Carney, before the election, the first day he took over, unilaterally killed the carbon tax because, he's not stupid. So Keir Starmer and Tony Blair are actually making noises about pulling out of net zero. Why could the Dutton team not have just said the whole election is going to be about pulling out of the Paris Accords and net zero? And here's why it is impoverishing us all. And what sense does it make to be impoverishing ourselves when the Americans have pulled out of net zero? China builds 2 coal-fired plants a week. India, we don't account for any emissions, zero. We could go back to the Stone Age tomorrow and no, it wouldn't make any difference at all. And here we have these people saying we have to be a moral beacon to the world by impoverishing ourselves with these sort of windmills that don't work. And the answer,
well, as I said on X the other day, which got a lot of traction, coal only changes the planet, changes the weather when white people burn it.
Yeah, that's right. And, look what's happening in Spain. Everyone knows that Spain and Portugal, renewables aren't going to work. Yeah. So the irony is, I think, when it's going to be a left-wing guy like Starmer who says, look, he won't pull out of net zero. What he'll say is we're going to push it back another 60 years, which effectively you don't have to pay any attention to it. And of course, conservative parties will back him up. There won't be a fight at all. And he'll get all the credit. And why Dutton didn't want to make this an election about net zero is because half the party room, I think, shouldn't be in the Liberal Party. Half the party room, I don't know. I'm making that.
Well, that leads me to the ultimate question, Jim. That does the Liberal Party need to be replaced? If it loses this election, the next election should be a different. As it will be in Britain, there should be a new Conservative Party with a new a constitution and way of selecting candidates and voter base.
Well, again, if you live in a first past the post system, another reason it's better, you can start a new party and watch what happens with reform. I think it's today in the UK, or it's Thursday in the UK, or tomorrow. They're having local elections and they're having the by-election in a Labour northern seat with they have a majority of 16,000. If the polls are to be believed, Reform has a real chance of winning that by-election. So in other words, coming from zero to overcoming a 16,000 vote lead, which is huge. And they're going to clean up in all the local council elections, even though Labour rigged it so that only half of the local council elections are on offer. The Tories will be obliterated. Labour will be obliterated. Reform has a real prospect of winning the next general election. You can't do that in Australia because preferential voting will always get those people in the ballot box who, giving a second preference, they don't just get to say Reform, they would then say Conservatives over Labour. And Labour would preference Conservatives over Reform. And so Conservatives would win on left-wing votes.
Yeah,
that is the problem with preferential voting. Now, how you fix Australia, in my view, is you copy the John Ruddock claims or prescriptions. You need to change the way we pick the leader in the Liberal Party. And this is what's happened in Canada. So, 100 years ago, all the Anglosphere, Westminster world, the party room picked the leader. That's no longer true in Britain. They have a modified system. In Canada, everybody who joins the party and is a member for over a year and a day or something, has an equal vote with a cabinet minister on who's the leader. So Poilievre would never, ever, ever have been picked by the party room. Danielle Smith in Alberta was chosen from outside Parliament. She had to win a seat. The party base would sort out the Liberal Party quickly because they would not stand for Turnbull ever having taken over the party. The party base would never have voted for Turnbull, and they wouldn't stand for the sort of Susan Ley, Black Hand Gang worthlessness. And once you have the approval of the party base, and only they can remove you, that's Canada. So Poilievre can't be removed, even though he lost his seat. He has to be removed by the party base, and just to get back into Parliament, he'll need to win a seat. But they can arrange that; they can get someone to step down. But that sorts out the party, because once all these careerist politicians realize there's no way to get rid of Tony Abbott, so we're not going to indulge in this Malcolm Turnbull type nefarious defenestration stuff, they get on board. And so the way I would try to sort things out is by changing the constitution of the Liberal Party. So and the MPs aren't going to like this, but you give them the same vote as anybody who's been a member of the party for a year, and just look at what that has done in Canada, which is a very, very left-wing place. It's created the party base wants real conservatives. The trouble in Britain is they tried to, be Solomon and split the loaf, split the baby. So what they've done is the MPs get to deliver the two names, and then the party base votes for, and the MPs keep trying to rig the game. So they gave you Sunak and Truss, and the party base voted for Truss, so they got rid of Truss.
Yeah.
So they hate letting the party base have a say, and what that means is that, I'll just give you the statistic. The listeners won't believe it. In Canada, which has about 50% more population than here, it's about 36, 37 million, 38 million. The Conservative Party has 750,000 paid-up Conservative members. Best guess here in Australia is the Liberal Party has 20,000 paid-up members, 20,000 versus 750,000. If it were proportional to population, the party in Australia would have something like 500,000 paid-up members.
Wow. And that's because they get to select their leader.
Of course. And what's the point of being a leader here? The party doesn't care about the base. They don't, they ram in, they pre-select against the party base. They don't care what the party base thinks. They just care about, how can we rescue Tim Wilson's seat against the Teal? Let's have policies against the Teals. Worst possible approach. They should be aiming for the suburbs. They should be doing what Poilievre did. In a country like Australia, which is much more conservative, if we had a Poilievre, it would be a slaughter for the Libs.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be able to decide what to have for breakfast without consulting with a team of useless advisors who have to run 8 focus groups.
Yeah. And even then it's inedible.
No, yeah. What's the least offensive food we can serve?
Yeah. Yeah. Burnt toast and black coffee is what he winds up eating. Jim, thanks for your insights. You've given us a little bit more insight into what's happening in the world today, but I'm not sure if we're feeling a little bit more optimistic after all that. But thanks for your time, Jim.
The two guys with the best hairdos probably on the podcast universe. I mean,
and both in collared shirts.
Yeah, and collared shirts.
What more could you ask for?
Right, it's just class. It's pure class.
Good on you, Jim. Thanks for your time, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Fred.
Cheers, mate.